In 2016, the worldwide gaming corporation Blizzard made waves in the gaming community when they released their first completely new piece of intellectual property in 18 years, Overwatch. They then made even more waves when it was revealed in December 2016's comic Reflections that Tracer, the character on the box art for the game, is a lesbian. The announcement polarised the community and has since led to the appearance of more queer characters in online multiplayer FPS games. But Blizzard had no intention of stopping there, as in early 2019, a second character, Soldier 76, was also revealed to be gay. Tracer and Soldier are both damage-dealing, or DPS characters, and have been part of the Overwatch hero roster since the game's early stages of development. They're two of the most recognisable characters to people outside of the Overwatch community, and they're fan favourites as well. Tracer, aka Lena Oxton, is a former RAF test pilot and the youngest person ever to be inducted into Overwatch's experimental flight program, as part of a larger international task force. Whilst test piloting a new teleporting aircraft called the Slipstream, an accident with the teleportation matrix caused her to disappear. Once she reappeared several months later, she kept fading in and out of reality and time. This was until Winston, a literal guerrilla scientist from Overwatch, developed the Chronal Accelerator, which anchored Tracer to the present, as well as allowing her to manipulate her own timeline. This gave her the blink speed ability and the rewind ability that we see in-game, and is the reason that Tracer went on to join Overwatch as a field agent on the ground, rather than in the air. Soldier 76, aka Jack Morrison, began his life as a farmer's son in Indiana, USA. As soon as he turned 18, he joined the US military's response to the Omnic Crisis, a period in history in which robots known as the Omnics rose up against their human creators all across the globe. Although he never intended to pursue a military career, Soldier quickly climbed the ranks and earned a position in the Soldier Enhancement Program, which granted him superhuman speed, strength, and agility. After the Omnic Crisis, Soldier was given the title of Strike Commander for Overwatch, and led the program in its expansion into science, infrastructure, and climatology in order to better people's lives. Before Overwatch, I hadn't really been interested in FPS, or first-person shooter, games. Well, unless you count Splatoon for the Wii U. But something about this game really stood out to me, and I became hugely invested in its characters, gameplay, and world building. I bought the game on release day after watching tons of beta content, and quickly fell in love with it. Needless to say, as a bisexual non-binary person, I was so excited when the Reflections comic was released in December 2016, and I got to see a canonically queer character in my favourite video game. I'm still a huge fan of Overwatch, and I'm sure I will continue to be, but the game isn't perfect. I think it's important for fans to critique their favourite things, rather than giving them a free pass because of how much they love them. So that's exactly what I'm going to do today. I'm going to look at Tracer and Soldier 76 and see just how impactful their queerness is. Hi, and welcome to Game Assist. My name is Daz, and my pronouns are they, them. In this inquiry, I'll be diving into the world of Overwatch to see just how good the game's representation of queerness through Tracer and Soldier is. I'll also be taking a look at the wider community's response to the characters, and to queer players in the public eye. Before we dive into the content, if you aren't a patron already and you like what we do, please consider supporting us at patreon.com/GameAssistYT, and remember to hit those like and subscribe buttons. Spoiler warning! This essay will contain spoilers for the Overwatch comic Reflections and the short story Bastet, alongside general references to the lore of the game. This video essay contains references to the following topics and themes, including quotes which will be displayed on screen and read aloud. Homophobia, misogyny, transphobia, gay trauma, lesbophobia including fetishization, sexual harassment and abuse, conversion therapy, fascism, and neocolonialism. In order to fully engage with this discussion, there are some key concepts and definitions that you need to know, the first of which is queerbaiting. Rowan Ellis defines queerbaiting as the practice of hinting at but not actually depicting or confirming a queer character and or relationship on screen. It might also be linked to marketing campaigns or press interviews where the people behind the scenes will be coy or vague when asked about the subtext. Queerbaiting is primarily used to make money from queer audiences by creating a will they won't they culture around their characters, whilst not explicitly stating anything in the text itself, to prevent the alienation of conservative audiences. Rowan also points out that this practice takes place after the Hays Code, or the Motion Picture Production Code as it's officially known, was abandoned. The Hays Code was a set of self-censorship guidelines followed in Hollywood from 1934 to 1968 that, among other things, affected representation of sexual perversion on screen. This included homosexuality. Gay characters were not allowed to be represented on screen, or in some rare cases they could be shown, but they were not allowed to have a happy ending, as this would suggest that their immorality was acceptable. The code led to a lot of filmmakers at the time employing queer coding tactics that led to many of the queer stereotypes we see today. As queerbaiting has become more noticeable and more unacceptable within fandom culture, a third stage of pseudo-representation has started to emerge.
We basically moved from the baiting, which is this kind of underground trapping element, to the explicit catching. The trying to catch the queers, and then also catching us out. Queer catching is explicitly talking in the promotion of a film or TV show about a queer character, but not following through in the piece itself in any meaningful way.
Pay attention to the specific wording of that definition, because I'm coming back to it later. Rather than relying on sustained homoerotic tension between characters, queer catching instead hooks queer audiences during the press promotion of a text by stating that there is explicit queer content in it, only for this content to be mysteriously missing in the final cut.
So this happened with Valkyrie in Thor Ragnarok. There was a scene where it had been hinted that a woman was coming out of her bedroom, but then she also talks about the fact that one of the women in the fight scene with Hela was meant to be her lover.
Queer catching builds up our expectations before the release of a TV show or film, so that we only realise the queer characters aren't present after we've paid for our tickets. As Overwatch is a military-based FPS game, we have to talk about homonationalism in relation to Tracer and Soldier. According to Wikipedia, homonationalism is the favourable association between nationalist ideology and LGBT people or their rights. The term was originally proposed by the researcher in gender studies Jasbir K. Puar in 2007 to refer to the processes by which some powers line up with the claims of the LGBTI community in order to justify racist, xenophobic, and aporophobic positions, especially against Islam, basing them on prejudices that migrant people are homophobic and that Western society is egalitarian. Related to this, it's also important to note that colonialism is what spread queerphobia around the globe in the first place. Anti-homosexuality laws were implemented in former colonies like India when the indigenous people of those countries already had thriving queer cultures. Finally, it wouldn't be a Game Assist video if we didn't talk about capitalism. Pink capitalism, also known as rainbow capitalism, the pink pound, etc. in particular. Pink capitalism is the incorporation of the LGBT movement and sexual diversity to capitalism and the market economy, viewed especially in a critical lens, as this incorporation pertains to the LGBT, Western, white, and affluent upper middle class communities and market. We usually see discussions of pink capitalism around pride parades and rainbow flag themed products, but it can also be applied to the use of queer characters in media to appease white, Western middle class LGBTQ+ people. Homonationalism and pink capitalism are also somewhat linked, given that they mostly target those members of our community who already have power and promote surface-level equality over intersectional activism. So, now that that's all out of the way, let's get into the meat of the issue. In this essay, I ask the following questions. How, if at all, does Blizzard's inclusion of 2 homosexual characters in Overwatch allow for queer gaming communities to feel safe and represented within and outside of the game? How far is the LGBTQ+ community actually represented through Tracer and Soldier 76? And how does Blizzard utilize these characters to succeed in a capitalist marketplace? To answer these questions, I will be exploring 3 topics. How Blizzard and the Overwatch team represents the identity of its queer characters in a game without a fully fledged player versus environment, or PvE, campaign mode. The community's reaction to the coming out of Tracer in 2016 and Soldier 76 in 2019. And the community's response to and treatment of queer figures in the wider Overwatch community, such as Twitch streamers, YouTube creators, and esports personalities. These 3 topics should give us a clear and well-rounded picture of what it's like to be LGBTQ+ in the Overwatch community, and how the presence of queer characters within the game helps or hinders that experience. They should also help us to highlight the wider political implications of queer representation in AAA games and how capitalism plays into this. As Overwatch is only the newest in Blizzard's long list of online multiplayer games, it's helpful to explore their previous interactions with the LGBTQ+ community in the past. This can help us to contextualize the corporation's general stance on LGBTQ+ issues and assess any improvements that may have been made over time. In the past, Blizzard have enforced stereotypical and unrealistic gender roles through their characters in World of Warcraft and StarCraft 2, and made no real effort to tackle the homophobia perpetuated in these communities formed around their games. In one specific instance in the early 2000s, they outright blocked the formation of an openly LGBTQ+ friendly guild in WoW. According to Alexis Poulos' 2013 paper, Blizzard claims that LGBTQ friendly guilds would attract the attention of other players and become a focus for abuse. One Blizzard press release states topics related to sensitive real-world subjects such as religious, sexual, or political preference, for example, have had a tendency to result in communication between players that often breaks down into harassment. The inconsistency present within this statement is that guilds based on religion or politics exist, and yet an LGBTQ guild is not permitted. Blizzard's stance on LGBTQ+ guilds also appears to depoliticize the harassment faced by queer players. Although discrimination is not always linked to systemic oppression, it very much is the case in the case of queer people. Disallowing this queer guild, even with good intentions, contributes to the oppression of queer people in society. Not only is it clear that this rule is being used to penalise LGBTQ+ players by not allowing them to form a safe community in-game, when other religious or political guilds have been allowed, but Blizzard's reasoning for disallowing these sorts of guilds reveals their lack of dedication to tackling harassment and abuse in their games. It's also just plain queerphobic. This statement from the company pins the blame on the marginalised players for wanting to form a safe space, rather than expressing a commitment to holding cyberbullies accountable who target these spaces. If Blizzard knew that an LGBTQ+ friendly guild would attract negative attention, they could have proactively assigned stronger moderation tools to that group, rather than banning the space altogether. As we will discuss later on, being openly LGBTQ+ in an online video game setting, along with showing signs of belonging to any other oppressed group, such as women or people of colour, already comes with enough issues, without Blizzard actively making it harder for these players to engage with their product. Similar issues have arisen in the Overwatch community since the game's launch, and they have only recently been resolved in a meaningful way. For the first 3 or so years of playing, it was almost impossible to get a player banned for queerphobic language either in text chat or voice chat. Players weren't kept up to date with the progress of their complaints, and the most effective solution to this problem was to block a player, which once again puts the labour on the marginalised player to defend themselves, rather than the developer and publisher, in this case, both a Blizzard, to make their game a safe space. With the addition of a profanity filter that censors foul language and slurs in the text chat, a player endorsement system that rewards good teamwork and sportsmanship, the option to avoid toxic players that you have encountered as teammates for up to 7 days, and the faster, more communicative reporting system, things have started to get better for marginalised players, but it still took nearly 4 years of fan feedback for us to get to this point. It's also important to consider the difference between queer representation and queer storytelling when looking at Overwatch's treatment of Tracer and Soldier. In the past, and even in cases like Love Simon recently, having a queer character in your story, even if they are sidelined and underdeveloped, was heralded as great queer representation. But now, the LGBTQ+ community is starting to rightfully ask for more from the media they consume. The difference between a queer story and queer representation in a story can be illustrated using examples from gaming's closest media relative, film. Examples of queer representation that immediately come to mind are Damien from Mean Girls and Wallace Wells from Scott Pilgrim vs. the World. These characters are both gay men, and their gayness is mentioned several times in their respective movies. They are also both side characters whose main function in the narrative are to provide comic relief, and to further the plot of the main heterosexual character. Damien and Wallace are examples of what Rowan Ellis would call incidental queer representation.
There's a difference between incidental LGBT characters and a queer-focused story. A side character, parents of a teen protagonist, or one character in an ensemble are all incidental.
This is using her axis of queer representation from invisible to incidental and then to queer-focused. They are two gay characters in an ensemble cast of mostly straight characters, whose stories add very little to the main plotline. They are also seen to be removed from a larger LGBTQ+ community, and seen as the token gay friend.
Sometimes these films won't be focused on an LGBT person, but will have them as part of an ensemble at large, which isolates them from an LGBT community and stops the film really having to go very far in looking at what that community looks like.
I could go on about how Janice Ian should have been a lesbian, and her friendship with Damien would have been an expression of queer solidarity in a heteronormative high school social structure, but that's a topic for another time. We can then compare Damien and Wallace to the lead characters from Moonlight, The Miseducation of Cameron Post, and Pride: Chiron, Cameron, Joe, and Mark. Not only do all three of these films have queer leads, they also tell explicitly queer stories.
Whereas a main character in a non-ensemble film, a group of queer leads, and exploring queer issues are all queer-focused. And then on the other side of the spectrum, we have this liberation kind of area. These are more likely to be made by queer creators or with queer people at the heart of the process or the subject matter.
Moonlight tells the story of a young black boy, Chiron, coming to terms with what it means to be a black man in America and discovering his sexuality along the way. The Miseducation of Cameron Post explores the effects of conversion therapy, and Pride follows a group of LGBTQ+ activists in Thatcher's Britain who raise money for Welsh miners during the strikes. These stories present queerness as more than just a personality quirk, and make no attempts to impose heteronormative narratives onto queer characters. All of these films also make reference to a larger queer community that the characters exist within: Chiron's friend Kevin, the other members of God's Promise conversion camp, and the thousands of marchers at the 1985 Gay Pride Parade. This more liberating, nuanced, and queer-focused approach is the direction that many members of the LGBTQ+ community want to see our representation going in. That being said, these films are far from perfect politically, but the more queer films that are made with this approach, the closer we will get to that intersection of politically salient yet nuanced and personal queer storytelling. When it comes to the gaming industry, the diversity of the character roster is only the tip of the iceberg. Aureliac and Lemire state in their 2020 paper that ensuring equity in industry hiring practices, eliminating exploitative working conditions like crunch, adopting a culture-wide resistance to bigotry, and mitigating abusive behaviour are just some of the larger issues of social justice restoration needed in games culture. Nevertheless, representation matters. The same can just as easily be said for film, and we've seen the positive outcomes of equity hiring practices in films like Moonlight and The Miseducation of Cameron Post, directed by Barry Jenkins and Desiree Akhavan respectively. Aureliac and Lemire are right in saying there is a lot more to be done to liberate the gaming industry, but they are also right in saying that this representation, however small, is still a step in the right direction. So, with that being said, let's take a look at Tracer and Soldier's canon queerness in Overwatch. Both Tracer and Soldier's sexualities were revealed to fans through short pieces of fiction released on the official Overwatch website, in a Christmas comic in 2016 and a short story focused on another character in the roster, combat medic and sniper Anna Amari, in 2019 respectively. Interestingly, both stories were also accompanied by a clarification tweet from Overwatch's lead writer at the time, Michael Chu. It is these two pieces of information that confirm Tracer's lesbian identity and Soldier's gay identity. It could be said that some of the shocked and negative reactions that emerged around Tracer's coming out in 2016 were strange, as representatives from Blizzard and Overwatch had confirmed in the lead up to the game's release that it would feature LGBTQ+ characters. They also said that, from the beginning, we've wanted the universe of Overwatch to feel welcoming and inclusive, and to reflect the diversity of our players around the world. It has been confirmed that these characters were queer from the very beginning, as some were doubtful that Soldier's coming out was retroactive. For those who are unaware, retroactively changing a character's backstory or identity, often referred to as retconning, is not viewed as positive or meaningful LGBTQ+ representation in media. The most famous example of queer retconning would be J.K. Rowling stating after the release of all 7 Harry Potter books that Dumbledore was gay and had a romantic relationship with Grindelwald in the past. It is clear from Rowling's writing that she had no intention of making Dumbledore gay when she initially came up with his character, or at any point during the writing of the series. At a push, fans may have read his past friendship with Grindelwald as something more, but aside from this, there was nothing in the text or subtext to suggest that Dumbledore was queer. This is not good representation, as his queerness is not visible in the text. Rowling likely retconned Dumbledore's sexuality after the book's publication to gain favour with queer fans, rather than to offer any meaningful insight into LGBTQ+ wizards and witches in the Harry Potter universe. A comment was also made on the decision to reveal the characters' sexualities through stories that we feel really do them justice. Given the context that we have laid out around queer representation and queer storytelling, this statement reads to me as, we wanted to reveal their sexuality in a story that isn't about them being gay. Creators of films, TV shows, and video games often frame queerness in a way that means it doesn't get discussed. If a character is straight, we don't discuss their sexuality and they are assumed to be straight. If a character is queer, we find out as part of a larger, non-sexuality related story, and it is never touched upon again. This mindset seems to brush over queerness as if it's something that becomes irrelevant past the point of coming out. Not that coming out is a single event, as many people in the queer community will tell you. It also suggests that queer people don't like to discuss their sexuality or their queerness. This may be true of some people, but I for one love discussing the intricacies of my identity, and how much I love being queer. This is another move to normalise and assimilate queerness into the existing cis-heteronormative model. Soldier's coming out is particularly non-queer focused, as he takes the role of a secondary character in the Bastet story, which is focused on Anna. We see him looking at an old photograph of his younger self and a man who we are told is named Vincent. This photo had previously appeared in the Reflections comic, which I'll cover more later. Soldier's past relationship with Vincent is even used to parallel Anna's own failed marriage. Vincent, I haven't thought about him in years, Anna said. Still keeping a candle lit for him? Jack shook his head. Nothing like that. You've never looked in on him? You must have been curious. All the surveillance power in the world. I bet Gabe would have put a Blackwatch agent on him if you'd asked, Anna said. Jack glared at her. Okay, touchy subject. Jack laughed. He got married. They're very happy. I'm happy for him. Vincent deserved a happier life than the one I could give him, Jack sighed. We both knew that I could never put anything above my duty. Everything I fought for was to protect people like him. That's the sacrifice I made. Relationships don't work out so well for us, do they? Anna said, unconsciously rubbing her thumb over where her wedding ring used to be. Throughout this whole scene, Soldier's failed relationship with Vincent is being used to emphasise through parallel Anna's failed heterosexual marriage to her daughter Farah's father. The importance of this being a failed relationship will be discussed later on. Soldier's sexuality is only revealed in this context to bolster the story and narrative progression of a heterosexual character and heterosexual narrative. This direct comparison also acts as a form of normalization of queerness, but only when it mirrors the cis-heteropatriarchal status quo. This assimilation of LGBTQ+ people and relationships into the dominant culture is what leads to the development of harmful neocolonial movements like Homonationalism. Assimilated into the cis-heteropatriarchal structure, Homonationalists are used as tools to further perpetuate neocolonialism, hurting members of the wider LGBTQ+ community, specifically queer people of colour in the Global South, in the process. This allows white queers to assimilate into, and by extension maintain, the existing systems of power that actively hurt their cutie pox siblings. Comparatively, in the Christmas comic Reflections where Tracer comes out to the fans, she is the central focus of the story. We follow her around London as she desperately searches for a last-minute gift, which we later find out was for her girlfriend Emily. The comic shows their shared flat and a snippet of their domestic life together, as well as the full panel of them kissing. Not only that, but the overarching theme of the comic, as it links to the other members of Overwatch, is the importance of found family, a concept which is very closely linked to queer identity. So the presence of queer identities in the Overwatch character roster is undeniable based on the information given to us through these external sources. But what about the content in the game itself? The main challenge that Overwatch faces in delivering story information to the audience is its lack of campaign mode. The structure of a multiplayer player versus player, or PvP, shooter doesn't necessarily allow for traditional storytelling methods, so the game instead relies on a combination of ancillary texts like the comics, short stories, and cinematics, and in-game features such as cosmetics, maps, and event-specific PvE story missions. There are only 5 in-game references to Tracer or Soldier's queerness or relationships in Overwatch. These are 2 voice lines.
Hey, Tracer, you and Emily want to hit the slope sometime?
Absolutely! If you think you can keep up with us. Wonder if I have time to visit Emily. No. Better stay focused.
And 3 sprays, which are cosmetic items in the form of images that a player can spray around the map, like a graffiti tag. Both of the voice lines are in reference to Tracer and Emily, In neither of these voice lines is it explicitly clear that they are romantically involved. It's not even that clear based on context or vocal tone, unless you already know who Emily is. Two of the sprays also feature Emily, once with Tracer, May, and Winston on a sofa in the spray Watch Party Gibraltar, and the other on her own. Neither of these make reference to her relationship with Tracer. The final spray is Jack and Vincent, and it depicts the same photo shown in Reflections and Bastet. Without knowing about Jack and Vincent's past, this photo could easily just be depicting Soldier and one of his friends, perhaps from his time in the army. It's also interesting to note that both the Jack and Vincent spray and the Watch Party Gibraltar spray are not available as part of the base game. These sprays were released as Twitch drops for the Overwatch League Grand Final 2018 and the Anna Bastet Challenge, an in-game challenge to earn a cosmetic skin for Anna based on the short story. In order to unlock these sprays, a player would need to link their Overwatch account to their Twitch, and then watch a certain number of hours of a given streamer. So not only do these sprays denote nothing about the character's queerness without external context, they were only seen by a relatively small portion of the player base. So it's safe to say that if you take the in-game information alone, Tracer and Soldier's queerness is barely even visible. Although I recognise the narrative barriers caused by the structure of multiplayer FPS games, only presenting this information in ancillary text means many players will miss it. More importantly, it means that homophobic players are able to ignore or completely reject the character's sexualities when playing, as they have no real impact on the experience of the game. Rowan Ellis said in 2019, "I always talk about the idea that representation isn't true representation unless it can be seen in the piece of media itself, understood by its target audience, and that you don't need anything outside of it to appreciate it." Overwatch is the perfect example of this representation not being fully realised. In fact, it could also be seen as a form of queer catching. Although queer catching typically refers to external references to queerness which are then removed from a finished product, I'd like to focus on a specific wording of Ellis' definition. Explicitly talking in the promotion of a film or TV show about a queer character, but not following through in the piece itself in any meaningful way. Fans were promised queer characters from before the game's release, as shown in previous statements from Blizzard, and although there are canonically queer characters in the game, their queerness is not engaged with in a meaningful way, especially within the game itself. This method of queer catching allows Blizzard to profit off queer fans who learn about the game because of Soldier and Tracer, but also means they can retain their conservative customers by keeping in-game references vague and to a minimum. They also gain a free pass to question criticism from the LGBTQ+ fans by presenting them with their two gay characters. This is an example of tokenism. So, the way that Overwatch presents its queer characters to its audience is in a very detached and indirect way. In terms of Rowan Ellis' framework, I would say that Tracer and Soldier 76 are examples of incidental queer representation with an assimilated storyline. They are two lone queers in a cast of straights, and they don't talk about their queerness outside of the odd mention of a relationship. In-game references to Tracer and Soldier's partners, Emily and Vincent, where they do show up, are vague and allow for ambiguity in their relationships. These tactics are employed to draw in queer players who are desperate for any kind of representation, whilst appeasing Blizzard's conservative worldwide consumer base, including China, which is often cited as the reason for a lack of explicitly queer scenes in movies that sell to a worldwide market.
We also have the long-quoted China response, the idea that the Chinese market is so big and they are so opposed to any kind of queer characters that actually it's the best the film can do while, still being able to sell to that territory. That's difficult for a number of reasons, not least because I think it takes the hook off, or tries to take the hook off, the Western countries, who are still pretty bad at representation in and of themselves.
Blizzard has previously shown its dedication to staying in China's good books, with their reaction to a Hearthstone player speaking up for Hong Kong in a tournament. This was during the protests in Hong Kong against the Anti-Extradition Law Amendment Bill, a bill that threatened Hong Kong's autonomy and could have led to residents and visitors of Hong Kong being subject to the legal system of mainland China. The main concern around this was about the infringement of civil liberties, as Hong Kong citizens lack confidence in China's judiciary system and human rights protection due to its history of suppressing political dissent. There's a link to read about that in the description. In short, little to no space has been made within the story or wider world building of Overwatch to explore Tracer or Soldier's queerness in any meaningful way. Without these additional texts, there would be no concrete information in-game that the two were any less straight than the rest of the cast. This is entirely intentional on Blizzard's part, as it allows them to make money off LGBTQ+ gamers who are interested in the queer characters, especially if they buy the physical copy of the comics like I did, whilst continuing to sell to conservative gamers by keeping the character's queerness on the down low in-game. This evidence points strongly to the conclusion that this was never about the representation for Blizzard, but was, as most things are in our capitalist society, driven by a desire for profit. This is the case for the game itself, but has Blizzard made space for LGBTQ+ players and fans in the wider Overwatch community? We've examined how Blizzard themselves presented Tracer and Soldier's queerness to Overwatch fans, but now it's time to look at how those fans reacted. As there was a 3-year gap between the two characters coming out, and these are examples of a lesbian coming out and a gay man coming out, it will be interesting to compare the similarities and differences in fan reaction to the two events. According to Ingram, Waters and Silver, at the time of Tracer's coming out in late 2016, many long-invested Overwatch fans had grown resentful of the promise of a queer character as a marketing strategy. Based on this, you would expect the reaction to be mostly positive. This was somewhat the case, as these fans were in some ways satisfied with Tracer. A lot of fans were happy about Tracer's identity as it validated half of the popular ship between Tracer and Widowmaker. It will become clearer as we go on that fandom and shipping culture cannot be ignored when considering the impact of queer characters in video games. This ship, which is the second most popular ship in the Overwatch fandom according to Ingram, Waters and Silver, is largely enjoyed by voyeuristic male fans who fetishize lesbian sexual relationships. I went into this fetishization in a bit more detail in my Honeypop video, but basically, lesbian relationships are only viewed as more acceptable because they're seen as a kink. This is lesbophobic. Lesbian kinks reduce lesbians to the objects of sexual gratification of men, rather than the real human beings that they are. The invisibility of Tracer's sexuality within the game also plays into this, as men can treat her more like an object if they don't engage with her or her story on a human level. This argument was actually raised by Blizzard user Crojack1117 in a forum thread about Tracer's sexuality. They said, "The real question is, why a female? Gay females aren't really taboo anymore. What if they had chosen a male hero?" The increased inclusion of queer female characters in video games is largely down to developers pandering to their straight male consumers who, in theory, think girls kissing girls is hot. These same men have been known to commit lesbophobic hate crimes in the past, but they are able to claim some kind of immunity by saying, "Oh, I watch lesbian porn sometimes," even though this fetishization is also lesbophobic. There's also the added caveat of player sexual characters in games, which we discussed at length in our bisexuality as a game mechanic essay, which means that men are far more accepting of sapphic characters in their games, if that character could also potentially be attracted to them. The anger towards Tracer's lesbian identity from male fans comes from this lesbophobia and male entitlement. While researching for this essay, I found this comment on an EW article written by Nivea Serrao, reporting the news of Tracer's coming out. Confirming a character's sexuality is the opposite of being inclusive. They should have kept it ambiguous and not given any of the characters' canon sexualities, be it straight, gay, bi, or etc., while at the same time keep pushing that whole one or more of the characters aren't straight thing. If the point of having a vast variety of character types is to make it so everybody has a character to relate to, then confirming the sexuality of a character just serves to make the character less relatable to people of other sexualities. This just reeks of SJW. While I understand the impact that ambiguity can have when it comes to fans rallying around headcanons, explicit named representation is simply better. It is a political statement of acceptance of LGBTQ+ identities, and it also gives queer people something specific to relate to, in the same way that straight and cis people have had for decades. Cis heterosexuality is constructed as the norm in our society, so explicit statements of queerness are important to break down those assumptions. When developers leave the sexualities of their characters ambiguous, it's often more of a functionality feature, like player sexual characters, than an opportunity for queer representation. Also, linked to the issue of minimal in-game representation, simply stating that some of the cast are queer but not clarifying who exactly, allows homophobic players to completely disengage with Tracer or Soldier's queerness. The specificity of her lesbian identity and her sapphic relationship is a lot harder to ignore or misinterpret, making it a more concrete form of representation. In January 2019, we were told that Soldier 76 is also queer. More specifically, we were told that he is a gay man. This is an important distinction to make, as gay men are significantly less common in video games than bisexuals and lesbians, especially gay men who are as typically masculine as Soldier. Horeliak and Lemieux point out that several wide-ranging content analyses have demonstrated the typical video game protagonist is white, heteronormative, hetero-compliant, and male. Despite his gay identity, one could definitely describe Soldier's presentation, actions, and general machismo as hetero-compliant. The few gay male characters that are present in games often get dealt a terrible hand in life, either suffering tragic loss, often of a partner, or dying themselves. Soldier is not immune to this stereotype. Overwatch, the thing he dedicated his life to, was disbanded and criminalized. His best friend turned to the dark side, and he lost contact with all of his found family. What's more, the very story used to tell us that he is gay is the story of his relationship with Vincent failing. Tracer and Emily's relationship is in the present, and appears to be happy and ongoing, but Soldier is left alone to be a tragic gay stereotype for us to pity. At the same time, he is viewed as a tragic military hero, which serves to romanticize the military to the audience and further push the angle of homonationalism. He even gets less explicitly queer content than Tracer. We've already discussed the sheer lack of actual representation both in-game and the ancillary text, but within that small pool of content, you can see that Soldier's sexuality is meant to be seen as tragic. His one in-game item is a spray of a long-forgotten picture, and compared to Tracer and Emily's kiss in the comic, his memory of Vincent in Bastet gives us little to no picture of their relationship. The fan reaction to Soldier's identity was noticeably different to the reaction to Tracer. Once again, the fandom played a role in this, as many people were familiar with the idea of Soldier being gay through the popularity of his ship with Reaper. According to Kevin Webb for Business Insider, some fans were confident that the character was gay based on his relationships with the game's other heroes, while others felt that he took on an asexual role as the patriarch of Overwatch. Even if you're 100% certain that someone is LGBTQ+, your reaction to them coming out should never be, "yeah, I know," as this downplays the internal struggle of that person and also trivializes the fears they may have had about coming out. This still applies when the character is fictional, as fictional representation and its impact spills into real life. The quote from Business Insider also touches on the topic of Soldier being seen as asexual by some players. Linked to this, I think that Soldier's relative desexualization compared to Tracer definitely contributed to the more neutral responses. As an older gay man, he was never desired by the straight male audience, who were most outraged at Tracer's lesbianism, and those fans who are attracted to men tended to go for younger characters like Genji or McCree. As an FPS game with a plot centered on war, Overwatch gives us a great opportunity to examine the use of homonationalism in video games. Both Soldier and Tracer, as members of Overwatch, are trained soldiers who fought in an allied international force against the Omnics. Prior to Overwatch's establishment, both also served in their respective countries' armed forces. In fact, their involvement with the military directly led to the enhancements that made them suitable for Overwatch. Their military identity is integral to their characters, so we can't ignore it when talking about queer representation in the military. The military is intertwined with the dominant cis-heteropatriarchal society that we live in, and it exists to maintain the status quo in neocolonial settings. That is, the racist, capitalist, cis-heteropatriarchal status quo. The use of queer characters in the military, as well as celebrating queer military leaders in real life, serves to normalize LGBTQ+ people by assimilating them into the dominant power structure. These queer people are only valid because they fight for their country and uphold the white, straight, patriarchal and capitalist values of the nation. They fit into the norm by enacting neocolonial violence on people of colour. Military propaganda leads us to believe that the military exists to protect us and our nation, but this nationalist defence system only serves to protect those who are currently in power within the nation. So, as members of an oppressed group, why would any LGBTQ+ people want to join the military? This quote from James Michael Nichols for the Huffington Post in 2016 summarises it perfectly. As gay people have become normalised in American consciousness through recent historical milestones like the repeal of Don't Ask, Don't Tell in 2010 and the legalisation of same-sex marriage in June 2015, these victories have created space for the homonationalist American who abandons intersectional activism and advocates racist, xenophobic, capitalist self-interest. Homonationalism involves conceptually realigning the ideas invested within the realm of LGBT activism to fit the goals and ideologies of neoliberalism and the far right. This reframing is used primarily to justify and rationalise racist and xenophobic perspectives. We can still see the effects of homonationalism today, with Biden's recent appointing of transgender veteran Sean Skelly to his Department of Defense transitional team, a team which will almost undoubtedly decide to drop bombs on places like Palestine. As homonationalism is based in the normalization of LGBTQ+ identities, we can assume that in the future setting of Overwatch, this normalization process has only increased. As homonationalism-inclined LGBTQ+ folk tend to abandon intersectional activism and prioritise racist, xenophobic, capitalist self-interest, you would be right to assume that a lot of them are white. In joining the military and Overwatch, Tracer and Soldier are actively putting their privileged identities, specifically their whiteness, before their LGBTQ+ identities. In fact, Soldier actively loses part of his queer life, his relationship with Vincent, because he's too goddamn gay for Murica. The community's reaction to Overwatch's queer characters, particularly to Soldier, may have been helped by the widespread nature of homonationalism, especially in America. Soldier is a model military man who also happens to be gay. His decision to partake in the military was also a decision to partake in neocolonialism and white supremacy. Homonationalism has come about by neocolonialism becoming more inclusive, so that oppressed groups can join and feel part of their nation's defense, whilst going abroad to kill the other, which includes black and brown women of color, gay people, and trans people, mostly located in the global south. Soldiers' acceptance into the military isn't a sign of queer liberation, it's a sign of nationalism. When you add everything up, it would appear that Soldier's appearance as the stereotypical hypermasculine white military man, combined with his traumatic gay backstory and the invisibilization of his queerness in-game, all contributed to the more positive reaction he received compared to Tracer. Tracer's queerness is loud and current, while Soldier's is subtle and in the past. Tracer celebrates her queerness, while Soldier mourns the loss of his partner. This is the queerness that is acceptable in the cis-heteropatriarchy. The glaringly obvious factor that we simply cannot ignore when addressing fan reactions to Tracer and Soldier is the festering cesspool of misogyny, racism, ableism, and queerphobia that is toxic gamer culture. This culture, which centers around the construction of geek masculinity, is extremely prevalent in online multiplayer games like Overwatch. There are plenty of studies to back this up, which I'll be referencing more later, but it only takes a few hours of online play to figure this out for yourself. So this culture is constructed around geek masculinity, a cultural construction which, according to Choi et al., has different core values to traditional masculinity, but still seeks to other women and others who don't adhere to the correct form of masculinity or maleness. In the construction of both traditional and geek masculinities, violence, homophobia, and misogyny are essential. Due to the overwhelming majority of game developers and CEOs being white cisgender men, gaming is consistently constructed as a heterosexist masculinist space. This is true regardless of actual player demographics, as we will see with Overwatch, which has more female players than male. As Utanoya points out, games constructed as masculine spaces are therefore inseparable from the patriarchy and any other social issues, such as LGBTQ+ rights, occurring in wider society outside of the game. Despite all of Overwatch's diversity, it is still framed in this way due to its creators and its intended audience. For anyone who doesn't fit the mold of geek masculinity, aka women and LGBTQ+ people, revealing yourself as an other to your team or the enemy team can result in violence and threat. Pro player Geggery, who we will discuss more later on, was threatened online by another player because of her gaming prowess. He said of her skill, which had been brought into question, "I would visit her house with a knife if she was found to be lying." Anecdotal evidence has shown that homophobic and transphobic bullying are prevalent in online gaming communities, and studies have shown that LGBTQ+ gamers are more likely to be the victims of sexually charged cyberbullying. Some players also refuse to believe that their use of queerphobic slurs against other players is actually discriminatory, as it's becoming common gamer lingo. The normalization of this kind of bullying makes it that much harder for LGBTQ+ people to enjoy games, and for queerphobic players to be held accountable for their actions. Geek masculinity in MMORPGs can be used to explain some of the fan reactions to Overwatch's queer characters. The diversity of Overwatch's cast of heroes is a facade for the masculinely constructed culture surrounding the game. Revealing that Soldier is gay might prompt queerphobic players to refer to their peers who choose the character as gay, or call them slurs as a joke in their voice chat callouts. And the mixture of misogyny and homophobia present within the community resulted in the lesbophobic reactions to Tracer's queerness. This could be as overt as the pornographic content that exists of men turning Tracer straight, the denial of her sexuality in relationship with Emily, or even the suggestion that queer women in video games are no longer taboo. To conclude this section, I think it's pretty clear from the toxic geek masculinity that surrounds the Overwatch community that Tracer and Soldier's queerness is not enough to make LGBTQ+ fans feel safe and represented. The overall fan reaction to Tracer is steeped in the lesbophobia entrenched in geek masculinity, and Soldier's more positive reaction is linked to assumptions of sexuality based on fandom culture, the interwoven thread of homonationalism in his backstory and gameplay, and the exclusion and desexualization of queer elders. We've been shown time and time again that if you want to enjoy your Overwatch experience as an LGBTQ+ person, especially in competitive circles, you're better off staying quiet and not outing yourself. It has taken years since the release of the game for the reporting system to become robust enough to work on homophobes, and for the profanity filter to block queerphobic slurs. Yet, even with these improvements, LGBTQ+ players still face queerphobic abuse day in, day out, especially as Blizzard has limited control over fan interactions on third-party sites like Twitter and Reddit. The homonationalist pandering, combined with the disparities in consequences and accountability for homophobes and protesters in livestream competitive events, is enough to prove that Blizzard cares far more about succeeding in the capitalist marketplace than safeguarding and making space for its queer player base. The community is not a safe or welcoming place for us, and Blizzard has made minimal attempts to change this. As I've mentioned multiple times now, Overwatch has a significant LGBTQ+ fanbase who either play the game and or enjoy watching gameplay content. A lot of these fans are also content creators, streaming to Twitch and making videos for YouTube. And in the case of Austin Wilmore, aka Moomer, competing in the Overwatch League or OWL's inaugural season for Texas-based team the Houston Outlaws and continuing to do so for 2 years. Now I want to get down to the nitty-gritty. I want to look at a few specific examples of high-level Overwatch players who have faced queerphobic abuse from the Overwatch community, particularly some of the more prominent trans-feminine streamers. The treatment of these players with the platform serves as an amplified example of the queerphobia within the Overwatch community, and therefore showcases how Blizzard has failed to make space for their LGBTQ+ fans within the world of Overwatch. As a longtime fan of EVA, I've witnessed her get misgendered by other players in matches and seen the slurs that people throw at her during matches and on social media. She even faced queerphobic abuse prior to coming out as a trans woman, as many would assume based on her voice and her choice to play support, which is seen as a girl's role, that she was an effeminate gay man. One specific instance in 2018 saw fellow player Kenzo publicly misgender Eevee and question not just her trans status but also her lesbian identity. Another LGBTQ+ streamer that I followed for a while is Brianna, aka Rammy. I was lucky enough to get to speak with her about queerness in Overwatch's gameplay and in the wider community of players and content creators. To watch the full 20-minute interview, head over to patreon.com/GameAssistYT and pledge your support. We have tons of great perks including access to bonus content, our Discord server, and monthly hangouts.
Sure, I'm Bree. Most people call me Rammy. I am a LGBT Twitch streamer, and I play lots of Overwatch.
So what drew you to play Overwatch in the first place?
I was actually peer pressured into playing Overwatch. You can play Overwatch with us, or you can play Counter-Strike alone, and I was like, well, I don't want to play Counter-Strike alone. Launch day, I bought it and fell in love with it. I think I played for 15 hours straight the first day.
Oh wow. What was your reaction when Tracer came out in the Reflections comic?
I think Tracer is a perfect example of LGBT representation because so there is a common trope in a character coming out or a character being revealed as whether it's gay, lesbian, trans, what have you, where their focus is the trauma end and the negative end in aspects of being LGBT.
Yeah.
But when Tracer was revealed, it was, oh, here's a character you already knew and loved, but she's gay. You know, she's lesbian, and like she's just, it's just kind of mentioned, and it's awesome because like that's the kind of representation I think, you know, the LGBT community really needs, because it's just here's a lesbian just living her life, and yeah, she has a girlfriend and she's awesome. So like, yeah.
Whereas with Soldier, his story is kind of like focused around that gay trauma that you mentioned, because it's about him and Vincent not being together anymore. Do you think the community reacted differently to Soldier coming out as it was like a few years later?
I think the bag is mixed, in all honesty. There's a handful of people who are like, yeah, Soldier is good LGBT representation, and I'm of the crowd that thinks that he's overall good, but flawed.
Yeah.
I can't say I saw it coming.
Yeah.
Like, where Tracer is kind of queer-coded. I would not say that Soldier was anywhere near as queer-coded, so it kind of caught me by surprise. But, hey, I mean, I have certainly been caught surprised by people I know who have come out as, you know, LGBT. So, to say that, oh, he's not queer-coded, he can't be gay, I don't know about that. No, it was definitely planned. Like, whether or not people noticed it, that's kind of on them. But, like, yeah, when you go back and look at the Reflections comic, it's clearly there. This has been planned out for a while. And I think that that's right there is another good example of, hey, here's someone who's, you know, gay, but, you know, they're just living their life. They don't have to explain themselves to you.
What do you think Blizzard could do better to, like, include more aspects of their queerness into the story, whether that's through more like comics and stuff, or like actual gameplay?
I would say media is definitely the play. Gameplay is a little harder to like incorporate LGBT aspects into. Obviously, like the whole voice lines in the spawn room and all that's certainly great. And obviously with Overwatch 2 and the whole PvE storyline, I think we're going to see and hopefully see some of that brought into there as well.
Yeah.
But I think through media, like the comics, even animated videos, like their animated shorts would be fantastic. And I think that's really the play for them.
How's your experience of the community been, sort of regarding your identity and the identity of other people? And you can go off as much as you like.
Oh boy, yeah. It's complicated, as all things are. The Overwatch community is large, and for as many people as there have been who have been like ultra supportive and like all that, there's definitely an equal number of people who are like very not supportive, very anti-LGBT, you know, across different spectrums. But I would say it's overall positive. There are certainly, you know, the kind of people who are like, oh, hey, you should kill yourself because you're gay or trans, you know, in matchmaking games. And, you know, that's awful. I don't want anyone to experience that. But for as many people as there are who were saying bad things like that, there are a lot more people who are just like, yeah, you go queen and like all that. And I'm like, that's awesome. You know, I would not have met basically any of the most supportive people I know if it weren't for Overwatch. And for that, I have to thank, you know, Team 4 and Blizzard.
What have your experiences been like with the LGBT community within Overwatch more specifically? Yeah,
as far as the LGBT community in Overwatch, I've met some of like the coolest people, genuinely. People like Ellie EVA, Toaster, who isn't necessarily LGBT, but has been ultra supportive of the LGBT community and has just been like really, really welcoming and really supportive. And I'm like here for that. Annie, who I believe is now playing Valorant, but like, you know, she was a big Overwatch streamer way back when. Without Overwatch, I would not have been able to meet these kind of people. Especially given that I was playing Counter-Strike, which is a massive contrast to Overwatch.
What do you think Blizzard could do better to like accommodate the LGBT fans a bit more and like pay a bit more attention to them?
With Overwatch being such a diverse game, having a roster of characters from not just all around the world, but also being very different identity-wise, I feel like there's kind of an untapped market there for in-game content. As far as what they can do for the player experience of someone who's LGBT, you know, response time to harassment, that's gotta be better. And alongside that, you also work on that profanity filter. Oh, someone said a racial slur or a homophobic slur. If it's a bannable offense, why not just ban them? I understand that probably a rewrite or like a recreation of it would have to be implemented, but at the same time, I think that's something you should be focusing on, you know, when such a large amount of your player base is LGBT.
The profanity filter, the blocking system, the like avoid queue, stuff like that, all puts the onus on the person affected rather than the person doing stuff wrong.
And that's where I find issue, really.
Have you ever played like competitively, like in leagues and stuff?
Actually, yes. I have experience playing in Tier 3 / Tier 2, quote unquote. Previously, I played on the original GOATS roster. Most recently, I played for a team called the Dojo, which was excellent. We had a great time. But my experience on GOATS is probably something worth mentioning here. You know, a lot of the players on that team really homophobic, ultra homophobic, and I wasn't out at the time, so my experiences on there kind of scared me from, you know, once I started streaming, coming out, because I was afraid of how I'd be viewed and all that. So previously, I have tried out for academy teams back when those existed. And I did actually get kind of far through tryouts. And thankfully, I can say that my time in tryouts was not cut short or anything due to my identity, at least not to my knowledge. But the idea of, you know, trying out for like an Overwatch League team, I admit, I don't know if I have the skill for that anymore. My time on hormones have kind of taken a toll on my body, and my skill has suffered.
I feel like there is an invisible barrier to like women and LGBT people trying out for Overwatch League because of just how bro-y it is.
Even before the Overwatch League was announced and Inqueery was, becoming popular, there were so many people accusing her of cheating. That's the kind of barrier for entry women and presumably any LGBT person would have in that sort of space, where it's like, oh, you have to prove yourself, and it's just like, whereas any regular straight white dude bro can just be like, oh, yep, gun go burr.
What happened with Muma and XQC just made me think that that's an incident that got caught.
What's not getting caught?
Yeah.
There are a number of LGBT people across the entire spectrum in Overwatch League that aren't out. And I know this for a fact. Like, I know people in the Overwatch League and who have previously been in the Overwatch League who are closeted, who are just completely in closet, and they won't come out. Whether that's due to fear of how teams will treat them or how they'll be viewed by, other players. Mm-hmm. But it wouldn't surprise me, when stuff like that, kind of gets swept under the rug, really.
Fuck capitalism.
Hard capitalism, TBH.
Do you think there's that sort of same, like, masculine energy around competitive gaming?
There definitely is. For example, there was another streamer. They messaged me one day and they said, Rammy, I'm trans, and like I've been trans for a while, and like I've been hiding it from, my follower base, my friends online, and it's like I don't know what to do. I don't know what's gonna happen, and I basically just had to say, well, I can't tell you what to do, but like if someone's going to judge you for being you, that is not a follower base or friends that I would want to keep.
Thank you so much for taking your time to speak to me.
No, it's no problem. I'm happy to help out.
Muma was also subject to homophobic abuse from another streamer and OWL competitor XQC, who taunted the tank main on his personal stream. This resulted in XQC receiving a ban from playing in the rest of Stage 1, which lasts around 5 weeks. This ban occurred just 1 week into the inaugural season. That's how little time it took for a player to be caught being homophobic. I say for them to be caught because I highly doubt that this was the first or last time that someone in the OWL has been homophobic to Muma or any other players. In fact, the treatment of Korean pro player Geekery can serve as a great example of the misogyny and queerphobia ingrained in gaming culture. Geekery herself is not queer, but some of the comments and threats she received during her cheating scandal draw on queerphobic rhetoric. For those of you who don't know, Geekery was the first female competitor to join the Overwatch League. She is still the only female player in the Overwatch League regular season. She was also accused of cheating by her opponents in a tournament she played before the OWL, because she was just too good. It was so unbelievable to people that a girl could be this good at a video game that she went on Korean TV to prove to the public that she was not cheating, all because no one could believe that a woman was capable of playing an FPS game. According to Choi et al., although around 46% of the gamer population are female, only 5% of pro gamers are female. Given the treatment of Geekery and other women in gaming, I'm not surprised. I'm just disappointed. Once Geekery proved to the public that she was not cheating, many feminist gaming groups in Korea, such as Famers, began to cite her as a symbol for their movement, but she didn't actually want this. However, for Geekery, such association was so problematic that she publicly came out against Famers' feminist stance and stated that she did not think the accusations were about her sexuality and gender, adding that she did not want to be involved in any discussion of that sort. My dream is to be a pro gamer. Outside of that, I don't want to be a symbol or something. To some, this may be seen as a post-feminist viewpoint, and that Geekery just wants to play video games. But to me, this just highlights the real dangers that come with being marked as other within a space dominated by geek masculinity. She may have felt the need to distance herself from discussions of identity politics so that she could progress with her career in as safe a way as possible. This is also linked to the capitalist myth of meritocracy, the idea that in order to gain success in the capitalist marketplace, the only thing you need is your own merit. Meritocracy stops people from addressing structural oppression, like the patriarchy in the case of Geekery, and instead focuses on individual talent, skill, and dedication. Logically, those who are less oppressed under capitalism will succeed more in the system, not necessarily because of their own skill, but because of their access to support and resources that allowed them to hone these skills. Many of the arguments for those who doubted Geekery's gaming ability were rooted in transphobia. One user, Artisan Lime, posted, "Is she a real woman given that no one checked her genitals?" They asserted that no real woman could be this good at a video game, which is both damaging to female gamers at large and to trans women who are very much real women. Not only that, but this statement comes across as a very real physical threat of assault. Just as Gregory is the only female player in the OWL, Mume is the only openly gay player. This despite the fact that many have expressed their support for players like EVA and Rammy trying out for the league. Both players have stated on separate occasions that they wouldn't be suited for OWL as they tend to one-trick specific heroes, and this isn't ideal for an adaptive team situation. This is a valid enough reason, but as the team rosters grow ever larger, part of me thinks that there may be more sinister reasons at play for the lack of queer representation in the OWL. In conclusion, Overwatch made headlines for its queer characters because of the scale and scope of the game. The actual queer inclusion is just the bare minimum, and still a lot needs to be done to provide equal opportunities for diverse gamers in esports, and to create safe spaces within the Overwatch community for LGBTQ+ players to enjoy the game without fear of harassment, violence, and threat. Considering all of this, you might be wondering, why is there such a large and devoted LGBTQ+ fanbase for Overwatch? In reality, the answer isn't really that deep. Queer people play Overwatch because queer people play video games. Queer people have always been a part of the gaming community, either visibly or invisibly, and we will continue to be fans of games for a variety of reasons. Of course, the diversity of the character roster and the comments from devs have definitely helped to promote Overwatch to queer audiences as an LGBTQ+ friendly universe, and by extension, gaming community. Blizzard have made very good use of queer catching for Overwatch over the years, I must admit. As with any oppressed group that is scarcely represented in the media, we are attracted to the mere potential for queerness, which is then exploited by Blizzard for money. Pink capitalism isn't always as obvious as slapping a rainbow on a coffee cup, but it sure is effective.
Hard capitalism, TBA.
Although Blizzard has failed to make space for us within the Overwatch community, and the queer figures in the game itself leave much to be desired, especially with their links to homonationalism, LGBTQ+ fans have built their own small pockets of safety, as the LGBTQ+ community has been forced to do throughout history. We need to spread this community further into the teams at Blizzard and other games corporations. We need to be present in the industry, making spaces safe for queer gamers in multiplayer online settings, and writing radical and liberating narratives into games. Smaller studios have done a lot more for the queer community with much fewer resources at their disposal. This is simply because their reasoning for including us is different. Most indie games with queer characters have those characters to welcome all players, to display the diversity of their world, or to tell an explicitly queer story. Blizzard's main motivation for any decision in Overwatch is money. They make changes and include features that will help their game to succeed in a neoliberal capitalist marketplace. Imagine if Blizzard took the same approach when creating Overwatch. An alternative timeline where queer writers were employed to make Overwatch, a game about fighting fascism with your fellow queer radicals, instead of playing as a gay fascist. Tracer and Soldier 76 are both extremely palatable, white, homonationalist characters. They are not afforded the space within the narrative to explore their queerness past the surface level, and this makes them little more than tokens. This, coupled with the ever-present homophobia and transphobia found within game communications and on social media, shows that Overwatch is not the queer hero that it has been heralded as by many. I must admit, I'm still as in love with Overwatch as I was the day I watched my first Let's Play. The characters, the world, and the gameplay are constantly evolving and maintaining my attention, and I can't wait to see where Overwatch 2 goes. As much as I love this game, if someone asked me for a list of games with good queer representation, Overwatch would not make the cut. Thank you so much for taking the time to watch this video. If you enjoyed it, please do give it a like, and be sure to comment and start a discussion about what you thought. As always, a huge thank you to our patrons who make videos like this possible. We genuinely couldn't do this without you. Special thanks to our top tier ambassador patrons, Bee and Ditsy Doggy. If you aren't a patron already, please consider supporting us over at patreon.com/GameAssistYT. Thank you to Brianna for taking time out of her day to let me interview her, and for generally being awesome. Catch us over on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram for further discussions and conversations, and as always, thank you for watching and take care.